I'm just been putting a few notes down.
Hello, everybody. This is Tom Lynn, and I am speaking with the peerless Nick Bascom. I almost said inimitable, but I use that word too often, so I do enjoy it. So peerless.
I'll take either description.
So he's without peers. So, but Nick here is accomplished along various avenues, but notably, he's the author of some fiction. Maybe you could, Nick, enumerate some what project you really want to foreground there, because you've
Sure.
got a lot going on.
Yeah, you can currently purchase Mordor, California, wherever books are sold. Amazon's probably your best bet, but of course it's in as many physical bookstores as I could manage, and hopefully in even more here in the near future. But yeah, Mordor, California is available to purchase, and then the first part of a trilogy is forthcoming. I'll have more on that later, but it's that book is called Romeo's Delirium. That's the next project, but I guess it makes sense right now to focus on Mordor, California, which is available. And maybe too, I know you said fiction, but there might be a book of poetry that I might release in the space between the two novels.
And he's also working on some other stuff about the notion of parity, but that's still early on, more conceptual. That would be nonfiction. Though we could also interrogate
I
the
hope so.
validity of the distinction between fiction and nonfiction.
Yeah, I have a law degree, so that work touches a little bit on a lot of thoughts I have about language and literature, but also it touches on the law too. So it sort of hits all these big buckets that I live and work in, and so that's a project near and dear to my heart. But you're right, it's a project that's ever expanding, and it's sort of on the back burner now as I work on the fiction. So it might make sense to talk about that later once it's more fully developed.
So what will be evident, I think, and this is sort of why we're talking today, but there's a kind of irony, right? And what will be evident, I think, is that you are an educated person, and I think that it's also apparent by my means of self-presentation that I'm an educated person. Sort of children of
For better or worse, Tom.
for better or for worse, but our our debt, if you will, to that dimension of our society notwithstanding, I think we both come to realize the limitations of schooling. And in this regard, as a point of departure, I think we could take what's set up by Ivan Illich and his, I think he came out in 1971. I could be wrong about the year there. His Deschooling Society, a book which I actually, even though I read it at a point where I felt I was already pretty thoroughly disillusioned about certain societies, certain aspects of our society, our culture, and so forth. It was still like, it kind of blew me away. He has this knack of finding premises that you thought you had examined and then realized that they were still there in a latent and explosive form. And so we were going to talk a bit about that. And in terms of just focusing at one more point, it came up in part because you mentioned that you had been in a conversation with people ostensibly of left political commitment, but who exhibited a lot of resistance to the sorts of things being advanced by Illich, and we don't have to be beholden just to Illich. He's just a useful figure because it's a broad movement. You could,
I hope not. I think it's a great I think Illich is a great person to focus the conversation on, in part because the imbroglio that I've been the dust up, the virtual Donnybrook that I've been a part of has centered on Illich. But you know, even in just you know, we talked about doing this just the other day, and so literally just in the space of a day, I've thought about other people whom I recalled sort of talk about this issue, and my first thought was Emma Goldman, who has a little piece that I might quote from. I think maybe just to again provide some further context for the conversation, but I think it dovetails with Illich well. And she actually quotes Nietzsche too in that piece, and I think Nietzsche's also an interesting person to talk about in this debate because Nietzsche has like vastly different goals for education, but most people don't really. I think it's an aspect of his philosophy that people don't really think about that much. And it's, you know, I think rightly maybe, you know, more thinkers like Corey Robin or whatever are situating Nietzsche more on the right end of the spectrum. That doesn't mean that there's not still aspects of the criticism that emerge from, I think his is anti-education, that aren't really trenchant too. And it might be interesting too, I think, to talk about the different, maybe to contrast Emma Goldman's goals for education and Nietzsche's. That might help too. But I don't want to stray too far from Illich. I think might be a good place to start. But yeah, I think, and that's just, Tom, I think that's just scratching the surface of all of, I mean, this is a huge debate. There's a podcast called The Rabbit Hole, which has like an 11-part series on this. And I haven't even been able to finish the whole thing, right? But there are people who are, and Illich, they actually mentioned Illich in the first episode. So, you know, there are people who I think are aware of these things who are trying to interrogate them. But I imagine that you and I can bring a little bit different perspective, and I think draw on different sources too. You know, I want to draw on not just what people say about education, but sort of how this schism affects the way people view other aspects of life. You know, not just work and education, but also like architecture and other things, and literature and language. You know, I think it's all these things are connected. So yeah, I want to, I think and I think, Tom, you and I could probably, I doubt we'll get through the entire subject, you know, in the
I
space of
mean,
this conversation. I imagine when we finally decide to hang up, our first thought is, wow, there's so much more that we could talk about down the line with this topic.
I guess it would be salutary to clarify what I mean anyway by deschooling, which may not be, you know, strictly uh, Illichian or whatever, but where I have arrived at, and all those names are very exciting. And Nietzsche, that's a very interesting name to invoke. It's probably useful to sort of fold in other aspects of life. But what uh, became conspicuous to me in reading Deschooling Society is the way in which schools in their contemporary incarnation function, and they actually become anti-learning. And this is, of course, part of a broader thesis that any institution, once it realizes a certain scale, actually subverts the ends for which it was ostensibly created. And this happens with education through various mechanisms, part of which derive just from the exigencies of scale, where in order to affect a significant number of people in that way, you almost have to defer to a strategy of standardization. Well, standardization actually is inimical to organic learning, and it's also inimical to personal relationship. Now, a lot of times personal relationships become established between students and teachers. Certainly that happened with me, but they usually become established despite the institution, not because the institution. And in fact, even there, the institution will impose certain limitations on the extent to which that happens. The other thing is it sort of perverts one's relationship with the content, and it becomes a kind of power game. This occurs through the mechanism of social promotion, as it were, amongst others, right? Where you're actually being, even though on one level it seems that advancing through the grades is a kind of promotion, what you're actually being told is how much you still don't know. So you're in second grade, but you don't know as much as the third graders. And, certainly I experience that. I see that um, with kids in my life. They get excited, but they also then acquire a sense of superiority. And that dynamic, which it continues on through the whole process. So you're shepherded into a perspective of scarcity with regard to knowledge, and it becomes a point for power contest. And then from there, it leads on to the whole concept, the Illichian concept of professionalization and the role of the professional class in terms of structuring our society and denaturing our relationships and so on. And we could go on. I don't want to just keep going on like that. But the fundamental thing is to deschool society is to strive to transcend the conditioning which has occurred as a consequence of this mass compulsory education conditioning, which I think relatively radically undermines our ability to relate with each other in a constructive and fulfilling fashion. So that's what I mean. And then with regard to like concrete policy action, I am actually now, which is surprising, given my personal history, of the view that schools can be really quite reasonably abolished. Uh, of course, most people would find that like an explosive and lunatic thing to assert. But that's sort of from where I'm coming, relatively radical in my orientation. Um, with that, I should like turn it over to you. Maybe you can.
Well, I was sort of just writing down a few things that you were saying because there's like a lot of great jumping off points. I think it's a really good description of Illich's argument. I mean, the way I framed it initially, because I think a lot of people just aren't aware of it. The debate online is just it's sort of, it's really, I mean, as anything online, it's very superficial. And I know you and I can probably always take this conversation into the way that, like, places like Twitter sort of pretend to be a social a social sphere or the public square, and the ways in which they are decidedly not is really dangerous because they perpetuate this illusion. But the content, the conversation is usually, like I said, usually very superficial online. And so I thought, okay, let's inject some sense of what Illich has to say. And if I were to add anything to the summary, which I think you nailed it, is that schooling is mainly just this sort of empty credentialist it serves a credentialist function, and it primarily initiates us into a growth-oriented consumer society. And I wrote the word primarily, and someone said, no, I think it's secondary. But then what you said is that actually no, and I agree with you on this, is that it becomes less about content and more about the form, more about the delivery, right? The way in which we learn is more important than what they're actually teaching us. And the reason I think that primary is actually the appropriate word there, Tom, is that the actual content can shift, and still serve the demands of a society built upon progressive consumption. like those topics can shift. They could teach us different, we could learn different things. What can't change in order for that society built on progressive consumption to function is the way in which we learn, right? And I think that the idea is to make us bored and obedient, to prepare us for a life where that is the exact nature of work. Also, it inaugurates hierarchy, right? We learn very quickly to accept domination and subordination, and we know where to seek our place. We're taught to seek our place in the hierarchy, right? Like, I'm an A student, I'm a C student. This is where I fit. This is where I'm going. This is the type of college I can get into, which means this is the type of job I can get into. But it's all very utilitarian and transactional, right? That's the real that I think is where our conversation could really open up and where things could flower. And so you also talked about the pattern. And so before we get back to some of that, I want to provide a couple quotes from Emma Goldman's The Child and Its Enemies, which I think point directly to that, and sort of really, I think, resonate with a lot of what Illich is saying, which makes sense. But she says, every sensitive being abhors the idea of being treated as a mere machine, as a mere parrot of conventionality and respectability. Every institution of our day, family, state, moral codes, is making every effort to cramp human emotion and originality of thought, right? To shape every human being according to one pattern, not to well-rounded individuality, but into a patient work slave, professional automaton, tax-paying citizen, righteous moralist. And I think this is the other concept then, is that, like, because it happens off screen, so to speak, I think we forget, like, who's shaping the curriculum, right? That what we learn is also, I mean, we talked about form, right? But the actual content is also not determined by us. It's determined by a completely separate deliberative body, who determines what we learn. And then, of course, the way in which we learn it, grades, it's not an iterative process. We don't really have the opportunity to, like, correct mistakes if we make them on a test. All of that, it serves a purpose, and it's primarily, I think, serves the purpose of helping the state to produce good workers, people that it can sort of slot into these, very hierarchical positions, and that we're sort of trained to do that work and to do it in a certain way, right?
And it's becoming in a way almost worse than historically, because with automation, what you have is a burgeoning crisis of, like, the loss of millions of jobs. That's probably not hyperbole, right? Then you arrive at a circumstance where you have people, and you're like, well, what are we going to do with these people? The conditioning then becomes that they're conditioned not just as workers, but also consumers. So
Yes.
they then can control them, or the people become conditioned to understand their life as, in a very narrow way, a hedonic project, so that they can be mollified by strategies of sedation and pleasure. And this is also something which occurs within the educational project. They get hooked into this trajectory, and this arises in connection with the issue of content, like what is actually being taught, not just the form, which is important, but also what is actually being taught. So you have a shift toward certain sort of, like, so-called STEM disciplines. And the problem with STEM isn't the STEM. Okay, it's not science, technology, engineering, and mathematics per se. It's that these orientations have been framed, like, you get a calculus textbook, it's always going to be applied calculus, and and also like the reliance on screens and the encouragement of an increasing sort of enthrallment in the digital, and like who's making these decisions? Generally not parents even, okay? It's
Yeah.
generally, like you said, these administrative bodies.
Yeah.
And why are they making those decisions?
Yeah. I think that's an
That,
interesting.
by the way, is a phenomenal quote by Emma Goldman, right? I need to read that essay, The Child and Its Enemies. That sounds
It's
fantastic.
tremendous. Yeah, it's tremendous. I mean, and it makes sense. I think that Emma and Illich obviously sort of operate in the same sort of end of the spectrum as I mean anarchists, but and it is interesting to me that side of things in a lot of ways I think has a much clearer sense of of what education does to us than other you know facets of the left, let's say. And I know that you know you have a um, another sense of like what's going on with the left right now, but I do see a split there, at least in.
Oh well, at this point, I think absolutely it's interesting, like because here we are talking about abolishing education,
Yeah.
or not abolishing education, but well, I say you can make a distinction between education and learning,
Yeah.
terminologically, if you will.
Well, between
But
learning in school or education in school, and it's
conditioning,
something, and it's
indoctrination.
exactly, and it's something that the people who who are opponents of school abolition will always sort of sneer at. I mean, I was sort of amazed, not just at the, and maybe I shouldn't be because it's the internet, but I was amazed not just at the force of the disagreement, but the tone of it. It was like it was the, I think there are only a few topics that sort of elicit that level of like acrimony or sort of what I think maybe snide vacuity. I mean, it was really interesting how that there was, I think that was to me how I saw the strength of the resistance. Is it wasn't just that people were like, no, I disagree with you. It was the manner in which that disagreement took shape. um I was astonished by it, and like I said, I probably should not
Flesh
have.
out the disagreement a little bit more in terms of
Yeah,
content.
we definitely, I definitely hope to. um
Um, I mean, like, it occurs to me that like the voucher issue is sort of like a lens, right? Because ironically, the notion of vouchers was originally a left wing idea, but now it serves generally people of rightist orientation.
yeah.
And they're like, oh, that's just so that you can feed into the neoliberal project and what have
Yeah,
you. All right. But that's sort of a smaller issue, which might.
it is, but I think we can dispense of it really quickly because it is part of the disagreement. Is that a lot of people, when they first hear Illich's proposal for skill exchange centers in lieu of more traditional schools, their first thought is, oh, that's just you're creating just a version of free market, you know, economics. You're just doing that now. You're applying it to education. Like that's their first instinct. And while I might be receptive to some specific critiques of maybe the edu credits that he proposes and says, okay, well, if you find some kind of, free market character in that aspect of the proposal, then I'm certainly not. I don't see the proposal for skill exchange centers as a prescription. I think that it's a starting point. And Tom, I think that the whatever alternative we design, it must be, I think, something that we do in dialogue with a variety of people from different perspectives. As with anything, I think that informs what shape the solution can take for the better, right? And so, but I'm constantly amazed at that they see this idea of like, oh, here's a place where you can freely exchange skills, where you teach, you can teach, you can learn, and they hear the word free attached to the word exchange and think free market. It's like it's hard to the thing about it is, if you look at what Illich actually says elsewhere, maybe not even in Deschooling Society, but Illich thought that the privatization of education was the premier scourge of the entire
Right.
of the entire thing, right? And
And
so
he anticipates the internet really because he talks about how this is going to virtualize. He doesn't use the word virtualize,
yeah,
but it creates this de-centered and more oppressive framework
yeah,
of conditioning than the ordinary school,
and
which
maybe yeah,
ironically provides certain safeguards for the student.
sure.
Uh,
And it's not to say that like the current model of schooling doesn't have certain positive outcomes, and we can talk about that. Like there's certain things that it does well that we, but it doesn't mean that that's a defense of it overall. But um yeah, but maybe you can speak a little bit more about the sort of leftist history of the voucher program, because now it's just sort of a way for and uh I might tie in some Nietzsche here because I think it might be a good point here. But you
well,
know,
I don't know much. My impression was that it was something that got going in the 70s, um, and that it was a proposal that was mooted for more alternative frameworks, like Montessori's or Waldorf
right,
schools and things like that. But I'd be hesitant to say more than that,
yeah,
because I just don't know.
that's fine.
I
Yeah, and I was just gonna say that now, of course, it's almost the only people uh who are really strong proponents of it are primarily, like you said, right wing politicians and public public figures who um essentially want to. Okay, so Illich says this is a misconception too, and part of the conversation I was having online is that people said, oh, education's free, and Illich, our current public education, they say, is free, and Illich is very quick to and this should have been obvious. I think there's a clear error by the person I was speaking with. It's obviously not free, right? We pay for it with taxation, and Illich is quick to point out that it's actually a regressive tax, because ultimately the only people who really benefit from the graduating from primary, secondary school, going on to college, etc., generally tend to be the wealthier people in society, right? They are the ones who then like reap the profits with like the additional credentials that then secure for them certain positions, right, within the economy, that then pay them, right, pay them a certain amount that result in a certain level of income, right. And so
it also benefits them by concretizing class structure.
yes, oh,
Because if you don't succeed, then you internalize the notion that like you said, I'm a C student, or I'm a high school dropout, or well, I just went to college for 1 year, and that then it affects your conception of who you are in a way that can make certain that you're content
yeah,
to be where you are, quote unquote content.
right. But to the idea, to return to the idea of vouchers.
Right.
No, I
Sorry.
think I think the idea. Oh no, I was contemplating going another direction too, but I think I want to touch back on vouchers before moving into some other thoughts. But the idea is that I think that right wing individuals see it as another opportunity to sort of leverage the um, the tax base that funds education for their benefit, right? As a way to use more of the tax dollars as they are distributed to primarily say, okay, this will now allow me to put my child into a school which then is seen by the next round of the next level of schools as elite, which then is gets them into that next elite level, which is then seen by employers as elite, and so on and so forth, right? It just becomes this sort of channel of elite institutions, and it's just a way of sort of deepening that regressive tax, or the impact of it on the rest of us, right? It's a way for them just to sort of maintain that elite status even more comprehensively than they do, you know?
So there's a kind of irony because those who resist that right wing approach and I would insert a slight qualification there because it's homogenous. There are also elements which would deploy that because not all alternative schools are going to be sort of structured to put people on an Ivy track.
Sure.
There are some that, and then there's also like a broader homeschooling community,
Yeah.
which is often sneered at as being regressive in its general and kind of weird. People feel kind of weird about homeschool, like, ooh, what are they doing? They're homeschoolers. They're kind of like icky
Yeah.
things that they're doing at home. Um,
But so two things there
uh,
I would jump on. I would say one, you're right that that's not the only, and I think that the irony here too is that my wife and I might try to avail ourselves of the voucher program to send our children to schools that more closely approximate the vision of, I think, education that you and I are trying to eventually come to describe. It's not all the way there, but it's at least the sort of closest version of it that we have currently available that is sort of economically feasible, at least for us right now. But you're right. I mean, there's a way to maybe subvert that, if you can. And the people who primarily oppose it don't necessarily oppose it in that way. They primarily oppose it as, oh, all that money should just be flowing to public schools, which of course we're eviscerating as we speak, right?
right. So the thing there, and this is like another sort of crucial point, and this is why the left or people like who are, sort of affiliated with the Democratic Party and things like that, right? I don't know if that's really left, but what is often called the left in US politics, right? Their resistance to something to the voucher program is superficially connected, or not superficially, is connected with this idea that public schools are uh, a fundamental institution and that they represent a point of great success for the left in American history. Well,
And I think we should say
what that
I think we should add that there's a reason for that, and it comes up constantly in the debate online too. And that is, it's one of Marx's his version of like the 10 Commandments, right? I think it's number 10 even, right? Is that free public schools should be available to all, right? And so there's a reason why I think a lot of the leftists sort of take that view, right? Because it's sort of orthodox Marxism, right? To hold that view. But go ahead.
well, I was going to say what it shows is what I consider to be an inappropriate relationship with the state, because the public schools are ultimately an expression of the state.
Yep.
And I mean, this is the thing, in terms of the original vision. I mean, it's complex, the left's relationship with the state. But if you take as your point of departure for the of left's discourse, the French Revolution, and it's the left is at its heart anti-authoritarian. Of course, it has a very checkered history in terms of how it relates to that commitment, but that is the heart of the vision which informed its formation in modernity. And to countenance now, really not just a relationship, but an amicable relationship with the state, but one where they have, sort of, they've essentially become the hegemons, uh, uh, a comfort with the state as an acceptable institution is, in my view, to betray their origins, right? So the left's commitment to public schooling in my view, it represents an abrogation of its fundamental commitments. Now, of course, you run into weird sort of special situations which allow for, you know, I mean, the charitable reading is that public education can be used to um, attenuate the class divide by relaying the appropriate skills information to all people. But of course, it actually doesn't work like that for various reasons. You know, for one, the manner in which it's structured through property taxes and so forth, right? But then there are also deeper cultural issues that will never be resolved merely by shifting money around. I'm gonna try to spin around. I feel like I'm spinning off a little bit here. Um, I want uh, so like you could say, well, why are people so you know? I mean, I guess where my point, to just bring it to a point, is that generally the democratic enthusiasm, in the sense of the Democratic Party, about public schools seems to be rooted in an ill-advised relationship with the state, one which is unwarranted in its optimism.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think that I think that you're also hitting on something really essential in where I see sort of like the fundamental split um, when it comes to how people on the left view public school, and I do think it has to do with the authoritarian versus anti-authoritarian perspective. And you sort of what you sort of have said is that, like, you know, the tradition of the left is sort of rooted in anti-authoritarianism, but I think there's a certain faction of the left that thinks that there's a certain measure of centralized authority and thus a certain type of authoritarianism that is necessary in order to sort of defeat its enemy. It's not where I land. I'm definitely with you. I think I try to follow that. I think it's that tradition of anti-authoritarianism is a powerful one that we should follow, right? But I see that schism, and I almost see I think that really the defense of schools, I think that it's less grounded in, I think it's purportedly, like you said, Tom, grounded in this idea of like, hey, it has been something that has enabled more people to participate in liberal democracy, or it has enabled social mobility, or it has helped people prepare for the economy or whatever. I don't think that any of those things are actually true.
Right.
Right. I don't think that those purported defenses of it are actually the actual reason why people want to cling to it so much. I think that deep down that they feel a certain institution of repression is necessary in order for their vision of the future to come true, to be realized.
Well, it
And
may be in fact necessary, but
yeah,
I don't mean that positively. And
yeah,
like, I mean, we can be attached psychologically and otherwise to our oppressor.
yeah,
Uh,
totally, absolutely. And I think that's another point that I was sort of going to make eventually, but some of the arguments that you hear, right? So like we'll talk about that, but I think that the concept that I was starting to bring in was that ultimately how we, whatever our vision of what good schooling or fruitful education might be on our side, comes down to what your vision of the good life is. I think that those two things are inextricably linked,
absolutely.
and
And
of,
that, yes, go
so
on.
of course one common, I think, defense of schooling is that, well, now you're saying that in order to transform education, we have to transform the whole of life. Good luck with that, buddy. And it's like, okay, well, if you're not committed to that, I don't see how you can imagine yourself as part of the leftist emancipatory project in any sort of real way.
Right.
Like, I don't know, I think
Like,
I'm
it's
not sure how
surprising
you
it's
would, I don't know where you would envision yourself on the spectrum, but I don't know how you could envision yourself over here with us if you don't believe in that possibility, right? And so what I find, and I think the reason I find it, Tom, is that the two sort of areas that I feel that or let's say the other area that I feel people who are really strongly defend public school also are really vociferous in their defense of, is like really high density, urban environments, like, high rises and things like that. Like any sort of housing of any other character, they sort of dismiss as, impossible to accomplish the goals that they want to accomplish, or as, bourgeois decadence, or whatever it might be, right? Or as a vestige of the old life of our single family dwellings or whatever, right? And what I see is a sort of austerity kind of creeping in, that there's like this impossibility to imagine, like solving the problem of like housing for, affordable housing for people that also mitigates the ways in which we destroy our local ecologies. That there's no way to imagine doing that while also building beautiful, delightful spaces in which people live and work and create and, experience the joy, right? And so for me, it's like, when I imagine what life is like, I don't want just people to have more control over their life and work. I want them to have more time for leisure activities. I want them to have more time for creative endeavors. I want them to be more tapped into the sensuousness of experience. I want them to feel connected to and in command of the responsibilities and obligations that they choose for their life, and I think, like you said, sometimes we get back to your idea that sometimes we sort of like identify with the oppressor. I think a lot of times the leftists who defend school, or who defend a certain type of austere vision for our urban environments, I think they're sort of imagining, like they're still imagining sort of winning the game that their enemy is trying to get them to play, and that there's no sense of like actually creating a completely, separate value system in which, of what human flourishing can look like separate from that. It's like they're almost trying to replicate it with like a few key changes to the way in which, let's say income is distributed, right? Or whatever, and so it's like, I just don't see it as, and I think if you have, maybe another one of our favorites, Murray Bookchin, puts it, I think, the most succinctly, is that there's a difference between the utopia of the factory and the utopia of the garden, and I think so many people on the sort of authoritarian side of the left, the most they can imagine, the most emancipatory future they can imagine is a utopia of the factory. And to me, I just don't see how that lifts us out of the drabness of life and work. I see how it might have some impact on the ways in which we control our labor, but I just don't see it as sufficiently emancipatory. And I think that, if you have a vision of utopia as a utopia of the garden, in which we get to actually enjoy our life, work, and leisure time, then I think you'll have an easier time accepting a radical transformation of how we learn. Because you have to, every time you look at that debate, I ask people this, I'm like, okay, so one person, to get back to another idea that you said, is that some person said, look, the only way to do this kind of education at scale and with the same kind of efficiency that we have now is to use the existing model. And to that I had to say, like, well, why does it need to be done at scale? Why does it need to be done efficiently? Like, shouldn't we be breathing inefficiency into every aspect of our lives?
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? And so it's like, you're accepting, I tried to explain this to some other people too, is that like, if you accept the value system that the current model imposes upon us, that you will never see the purpose or the promise of an alternative way of acquiring knowledge.
No.
Like it won't happen. And someone was like, oh, so you admit it's not logical. And I was like, well, I admit that within the logic of the current system, you will never understand the value of another way of learning and interacting with people and sharing knowledge with others. Like it won't work. Like you have to first tap in to a different view of the good life and to a different, value system. And maybe before I turn it over to you real quickly, maybe this is where I can bring in some Nietzsche, because this is where he does resonate with Illich, I think, and with Emma Goldman, even if we'll talk later about how what he thinks the purpose of education is dramatically different. But maybe my favorite line or favorite concept that I take from anti-education is that he sees that the current system is designed to turn the link between intelligence and property into an ethical demand. And to me, that's like, I'm like, whoa, that is I mean, I don't know if there's anything that's more spot on than that, but to get back to the idea of the good life is that he says, like, look, students are transformed to be servants of a bureaucratic system, not prepared for a way of life. And that currently it's that our system is animated by crude materialistic notions of the good life, right? To train
he was writing this in the 19th century before what we have has, I mean, it's emerging then,
right?
But it's embryonic. It's not in full bloom.
Yeah.
Right.
And
so he already sees.
Yes, already. And that reminds me of this is just a quick aside, but one person I was speaking to said, oh, you're writing about Illich, a Catholic priest from Austria in the 20th century. Yeah, there's some really great ideas then, like almost, and I was like, you realize, what you're essentially saying is that there's no idea from the past that we can connect with. I didn't respond to that person. I figured the ad hominem nature of that argument and the idea that like the only ideas that have value to us are those from the 21st century was a little bit too absurd for me to engage with. But yeah, to finish that one line from Nietzsche, he says that, our education is animated by crude materialistic notions of the good life, to train everyone to convert their innate capacities for knowledge and wisdom into as much income as possible. And the reason, Tom, I want to bring that up is that another one of the arguments I kept hearing from people online was that, look at how public education has lifted so many people out of poverty. Now, again, you could take a broad historical view of that. You could look at its application in certain states with different economies, and you could do a full interrogation of that idea, right? But before we get to that,
I'm sorry, go on.
No, I know you want to jump in on that, and I want to hear your thoughts on that. But what I was going to say is that before we get to that, the irony of them saying that to me is that if most of the people who say that also have like the word anti-imperialist in their bio. And what I would say is that if someone from in defense of a colonial empire were to come to you and to say, yes, we ravaged the ecology of this country. Yes, we exploited all the workers in this area of the global South to help us extract as much wealth as we possibly could from their countries. But look what we did. We lifted them out of poverty. What you would immediately say to that is, no, you didn't. You changed what the definition of poverty is. And what Illich says is actually what you've done is you haven't lifted anyone out of poverty. You've created a painful modernization of that poverty. You've redefined poverty as having $2.15 a day, right? You completely altered the way that we think of poverty from having little control of our life and work, having a sense of place and community, like all those kinds of things, having, you've changed it to this just purely economistic measure, right? And so it's ironic to me that they would use that line, knowing the ways in which it is perverted by the very people that they wish to combat in other areas of their ideological struggle, right?
Right.
But you had some thoughts. I want to hear them.
I know. I mean, it's just, I'm just amazed sometimes to hear like of objections like that, and you don't want to make too much of them, but they're nevertheless indicative of things going on in the culture at large that I find distressing. Um, I mean, along the way, several things occurred to me. One is that um, one of the things that is done by the school system, which has been done over the past few generations, is that it has affected, in my mind, a remarkable de-skilling. In other words, people who go through a contemporary schooling process are generally less well prepared to deal with the real than even someone who went through it in 1972. And part of it has to do with that standardization. This arises from a few different corridors, but one of the things that happens with the imperatives of scale and standardization is you have to break down the curricula to what can be relayed in an atomized manner. So actually, the school system cannot relay actual skill very well. It can only relay what can be relayed discursively. And if you're going to be engaged in the world, if you're going to become adept as a woodworker or certain other things like that, it's just the model of scaled compulsory schooling isn't going to fit the bill. And what do you see? And of course, what you have is something which is over-determined. We are de-skilled, disempowered for all sorts of reasons under the dispensation of a capitalist mode of production. But, if you go to America in 1905, probably something like 87% of the male population could build a house. Okay, you're like, okay, I'm gonna go build a house, and they would know how to do it.
Yeah.
They would know how to build a house. You do that, I would say today, maybe somewhere around 12 to 13% of an adult male population knows how to build a house, if I'm being generous. Okay. Of course, that actually dovetails into how houses are built too, because now, not you to build a house, you might know everything in the world about woodworking, but then you have to know electric,
Yep.
plumbing, and all that. And the problem with having to have all those things in the house is that the house, we have to understand it is something which is connected to the grid of
Yep.
our society. This actually intersects with some of your concerns around architecture. It's actually another point of Illich. She talks about things that go on in Mexico where people are prevented from building their own houses, not because they don't know how to do it, but because these legal frameworks are imposed on them that provide artificial constraint and which actually exacerbate their poverty. And then another Illichian point is that modernized poverty is constituted not just by one's relative access to material means, but by an increasingly radical dependency on institutionality, right? And so in the case of schooling, for example, that's the whole problem of credentials and certification, right?
Yep.
You have to have arrived at this point in the framework in order to be able to be ratified as a possessor of that knowledge. And so then you see that it's not really about actually knowing how to play a piano, it's knowing how to pass a test, okay, on the piano. And those are actually two different things.
Yeah. The irony, so the interesting thing I should say about the house is that in order to given our current given the current state of the economy and the current state of the housing market, if I were to come close to being able to afford a house, it would have to be one that I have to build from the inside out. And so I would actually I would seek outside of school, I would seek the knowledge of how to, and I have some of it. I did some construction when I was a younger man. You know, I know how to do drywall, for instance, but the electrical that is not a skill that I possess. And so I would have to learn how to do, you know, the electrical, which is a dangerous proposition if you don't know. You know, on top of, like, you know, replacing maybe rotted wood, putting up the drywall. Maybe I've done flooring before, but like there's all kinds of skills that all of a sudden that we actually need. But to your point, Tom, there are barriers to even if you were to acquire those skills and were to want to utilize them. There are like barriers, for instance, in the financial system, like there are ways in which the different types of loans that the bank will issue to allow you to buy a house. And if you're buying a house that requires a certain type of construction, what do you think they demand? They won't just let you do it. They demand that you have a certified contractor whom the bank can then say, oh, we know that this person will do good work and thus will maintain the value of the home as we appraise it, right? And so you have to have, like you said, that credential, and then that person has to sign off on it. I mean, I'm finding out that there are the ways in which, you know, like you said, that we have become dependent upon institutions are extremely pervasive. And that even if we were to want to acquire and utilize skills independently, we'd have to overcome those barriers. You know, it's daunting. It is, really.
And to bring it back to, you know, the schooling thing, it's like, well, how do we actually transmit the knowledge? And historically, it was transmitted not within or through schools, but within and through familial communal relationship, right?
Yeah.
And which was more organic and holistic than what you have transpiring presently.
Yeah.
But now, see, people have been alienated from their capacity of familial and local transmission. They're actually almost like hesitant to pass knowledge along in that way because they don't feel like confident. They're like, well, I didn't go to school for this, or whatever it is that they tell themselves. And sometimes we just don't know because we're dealing with multiple generations of this degradation at this point. You know, I mean, it's embarrassing. I mean, I'm embarrassed, right? At things that, you know, I don't know how to do.
Exactly. I'm always
But-
embarrassed when I don't know how to do something. And then I think to myself, well, why would you be embarrassed that you haven't had the opportunity to learn something? Right? You don't know anything until you learn it. Right. And so I think sometimes too, maybe being online, there's a certain aspect of it too, is that everyone presents themselves as the sort of unalloyed expert of everything. And so you become sort of defensive in your posture to not having every aspect of knowledge. I mean, the thing, what I will do is I will lament, I'll listen to these podcasts and I'll say, oh my gosh, these people, you know, I just wish I had the time that they had to read all these philosophers that they get to read. Like, I read as much as I can, as much as time will allow, but I just don't have the time, you know. And it's like, you know, the fact that they've chosen for this to be their profession, you know, like it's a difficult choice because you just don't know if you're going to be able to, you know, what kind of within our current model, what kind of, you know, livelihood you can maintain in that world. And it's only getting worse, of course. But I always rue that I don't have the free time to do those things, you know. But I don't think we should be embarrassed when we lack knowledge. I think we should rightly recognize that it's a symptom that we're not in. The system doesn't want for us to have that knowledge. It's
right.
It's intended for us.
It does take time.
Yeah.
And the point is that school actually, I mean, I'm just realizing this right now as I talk to you, right? School actually denies us that time in our youth, which otherwise would have led to us knowing more than we do because we went to school.
Right.
Like if I didn't go to school, I probably know how to build a house. Of course, then I wouldn't know other things. Okay. But
Yeah.
that's a
Maybe not.
false like that's a false like I mean, there's a degree of so-called opportunity cost,
Well,
but
I think two things
it's
Illich said.
factory, it's a factory framework. You've been
Absolutely. Yeah.
conditioned
Oh
to
yeah.
exist with factory temporality, and the time which is put into conditioning children to exist within factory temporality
Exactly.
denies them the opportunity to learn how to farm or work on an automobile or build a house or
Yeah.
obviously I'm sort of valorizing what are referred to as trade or vocational trajectories, but that doesn't exclude the humanities. In fact, you should be able to establish an intimate relationship with them, more
Right.
effective relationship with
They
them.
shouldn't be mutually exclusive. And I think two things that Illich says would both be informative, I think, with what you just said. One, he says that I think he thinks, and I agree, that a vast majority of what we learn outside of the bounds of school. And two, one of the things that school teaches us that's dangerous is that education can only take within these hours, within these halls, right? And that anything outside of it, is a different form of knowledge pursuit, if it's even that, right? And so I think that both of those things are additional problems that school presents, right?
To come back then to Nietzsche,
Yeah.
and you said you were going to contrast. So maybe sketch how Emma Goldman puts it, and then contrast the Nietzschean perspective.
Well, I think I think this distinction is important because, you know, within the schism that we sort of see within leftist circles in this, at least as it manifests itself in this debate, I think sometimes it takes the shape of like the community versus the individual. And I think, obviously on the anarchist sides of things, they're always more concerned a little bit about individual freedom. But Emma Goldman says something interesting at the very end of this essay, where she says, that the education of children is not synonymous with herd-like drilling and training. Of course, that's what we do today, right? She says, in this way alone can we hope for the free individual and also for a free community, which shall make interference and coercion of human growth impossible. So she explicitly links the development of the free individual with the health of a free community, right? And so where the two differ is that, so Nietzsche's educational system is all about the production of geniuses. He thinks that so he sort of agrees with Illich when Illich says, like, look, our education system is designed really only to benefit a few people. Illich thinks it's the wealthy. Nietzsche thinks it's the geniuses. So in that way, though, Nietzsche would say it's okay that it only benefits a few people because it's the geniuses who will bring about this sort of positive spiritual revolution. It's never that's not. There's much less of a connection than in sort of Nietzsche's view of education to the free individual and flourishing communities, at least not explicitly, or at least it's by a very different mechanism, right? And so I think that there's a pretty pronounced difference there, and I think it's an important difference. And I think there's I think too, what Emma Goldman is tapping into there, to return to another idea that you brought up, which is like, sort of ancient forms of living, and other forms of relationships that have existed throughout history that maybe we tend to just elide in our conversations, or I think even more dangerously tend to sort of circumscribe in a past that we deem to be regressive, right? And which I think is really wrong. And I think it's also part of this. Like, people always say, that, hey, like you're trying to return us to like this sort of primitive society, and they always use sort of pejoratives when they describe this. And I think that's I think it's really ethnocentric to think that, whatever form our civilization has taken, or our modernity has taken, that is the sort of preordained endpoint of like human understanding and development. I think that it's decidedly not. And I think, one of the things I really love about, I don't know if you've read this, but The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wingrove, is that they actually do some anthropology, instead of just like relying like Hobbes did on, just inventing a sense of human nature, and just saying, yeah, I know humans are just evil and brutish and self-interested and all this. They say, no. If you look at our actual history, you find that there are strong senses of community care, and more importantly, Tom, to our point, that this idea of like individual flourishing and the success of the community were in many historical communities, not considered to be mutually exclusive. That they thought that those two things, in order to be fully realized, had to coexist, right? Like individual freedom and development and communal health, right? And commitment to the community. That those two things were never considered to be in opposition for a lot of cultures, right? Like that's an idea that certain people and certain communities and certain ideologies adopt along the way, right? And so I think it's interesting that Goldman taps into that. Obviously, Nietzsche goes in a very different direction. Like for him, it's all about that sort of production of the genius and the nurturing of the genius, who then sort of the rest of us then benefit from, right? Looking up to. Whereas Emma Goldman is much more of a sort of reciprocal relationship between individual and community, so yeah, so I definitely wanted to touch on that, because of they start from a lot of the same premises, right, but then reach very different conclusions, which I think is interesting. Yeah.
It's fascinating, the notion that the individual, the health of the individual and the health of the community are terms which are in tension,
Right.
can be arguably specified as particular to our time broadly,
Yeah.
being, say, part of the project of the Enlightenment or the project of modernity, which creates the frame that invites the idea that there is an opposition. And the idea, I think, also inherits a certain degree of energy from the fact that our style of community, which is aiming to a sort of dramatic homogenization, is in fact antagonistic to the individual in a profound way. But that isn't to say that the health of a community can't be realized. It just means that our society is bad both for the individual and for the society. Okay.
Yeah.
It's just but you can get sort of mesmerized by the optics. It's a false binary.
Yeah.
But it would be understandable why Nietzsche's idiosyncrasies sort of favor the individual, because he was trying to struggle with the dramatic disenchantment which occurs under humanity, the disenchantment of the world. And they didn't see a way to recover the ancient valuations which allowed people to live with a sense of wonder. And then in that vacuum, I think this is his error, he thought it was just up to the individual to create those values to overcome society and its strictures, the Übermensch and so forth, right? Yeah. I think it's an error. I think his criticisms are almost unassailable. It's like, well, no, he was right. Okay. So
Yeah.
Okay, but his response to his criticisms sort of similar to Marx, right? Where I think that Marx's criticism of the capitalist mode of production is virtually unassailable. He's really not even criticizing it; he's just describing it. And when you see it,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's you know full horror,
Yeah.
uh, I don't know how you could possibly you know reconcile yourself to the notion that it's somehow morally redeemable. It's an amoral system. It's worse than an immoral system. It's an amoral system because it's a system which uh, it's a system of subjugation, mass
Yeah.
subjugation, because the objective is the creation of abstract value,
Mhm.
and the laborer is just an appendage to that process. It invites us to become machines, and that's what's terrifying. Like one of the things that like was remarkable to me was like when you said, "Oh," someone said, "Oh, so you admit it's not logical." See, that's an incredibly impoverished sense of logic because what that person is
Yeah.
basically doing is capitulating to the proposition that you are just a machine, that we're
Right.
just a machine, and that's the metaphor of the moment, like this moment right here in the early 21st century,
Yeah.
where we're being conscripted into a narrative of the human person, which will fit into a project of digitization. And unfortunately, the discourse is doing a good job of depriving people from the resources to give voice to their intuition that this is not right.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I just started talking here for a bit, um,
No,
but
I agree with you. And I think you're right on both your assessment of Nietzsche and Marx. That and what's interesting to me is that many people online will say, "Oh, well, Marx believed in public education for all," as if that's the end of it, or as if you can't deviate in any kind of way from anything that Marx said and consider yourself a kind of leftist, right? And it's like to them Marx is the beginning and the end, and that's just that's you know missing out on a whole world of you know fruitful criticism and um, bountiful perspectives on life and work from so many people. And 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 I agree with you that there are other ways of conceptualizing what a post-capitalist world will look like that that don't emanate from Marx, you know. And so to this point of imagination, something that I kept saying, and that I think a lot of people, I've heard it most with Jameson, but I hear in from other people too, is that that sometimes a system can become so omnipresent that it becomes impossible to imagine anything outside of it. And I think that you could apply that both to our current mode of our current system, but also to, I think, uh, a Marxian concept of the post-capitalist world. I think you could say both. It's true for both of those things. And so what I think is interesting, Tom, is that when we say, hey, I can imagine a different form of life, one that provides more leisure time, where I get to choose what, based on my values, like what I do to help my community, or what I do for my own personal individual flourishing, or whatever, right? If we say, okay, I can come up with this system, it involves skill exchange centers, they'll say, if it's anything that's sort of dramatically different from the current system, they'll say that's ridiculous, that's chimerical, it'll never happen, not a bajillion years. So then if you say, okay, well, what if we came up with something that is still solves all the problems we want to solve, but is still somewhat similar to the current model of education. They'll say, you're just reinventing school. You're just doing the same thing we're doing now, coming up with a different name for it and calling yourself a genius. And so what that means to me, Tom, is that it's a no-win scenario, right? Like, they're putting the bounds here. They're putting the laying the markers down so that it's almost impossible to fit through them, right? Like there's no, they don't want to create the space for it because they can't imagine it, or they don't want to imagine something different, right? And what I always find is interesting, Tom, is that the people who are like, oh, I can't think of, or what you're trying to propose is so ridiculous that, what you don't realize is that what they always say is, well, the only solution really is going to be an ocean of blood. Someone actually used that phrase with me, ocean of blood. And Graeber and others, I think, say that like violence is a failure of imagination, right? And which I agree with. But to me, I think if there's any kind of indictment of the education of our current educational system, it's that it's easier, and our society at large, it's easier for people to imagine slaughtering millions of people than organizing a new way of sharing knowledge and approaching life and work. Like it's easier to imagine that. Like to them, they're like, no, that seems feasible. That seems viable to me. Doing, learning in a different way just does not seem possible to them. Do you know what I mean? And yeah, and to me, that is
it is people are enthralled.
Yeah, they're enthralled, and it's lamentable. It's a little bit it's disheartening. It's frightening in a way too. I mean, Barth says we live in a society that's both staid and violent, which to me is a toxic mix. But even if the people who purportedly want to escape that are constantly sort of drawn back into the mirage of violence as, sort of emancipation, to me is a little bit is scary. It's, I think, like I said before, a system being so omnipresent, you can't think of escaping it. I think in a lot of ways, we live in a system that is rife with violence, that is predicated on violence, that is violent in nearly every aspect of it, and that we just can't imagine escaping that, which I really dislike.
Yeah. Well, I share your apprehension.
Yeah.
I mean, what the point I could see is that the new is not comfortable. Okay.
Yeah.
It's not comfortable. And this is sort of like the part that's like it's not sexy. Okay. Because it does seem that a kind of renunciation is crucial here. A kind of aesthesis, to invoke Illich, actually, but this isn't just something that's Nietzschean, right? I mean, I see people who are striving to live out their ideals within this framework, within this society, and the decisions they make produce inconvenience for them, right? So, I mean, you could take homeschooling, which I think is vastly preferable to schooling, especially now. I might have said something differently. I might concede something differently in like 1987 or something like that. Okay, I don't know, but where we are at this moment, right? I think that if you want to protect your children, okay, from me personally, I think homeschooling is the way to go. But I know lots of people who do that, and it entails a kind of sacrifice, right? That's just an example. Okay,
Yeah.
there are other examples.
Well, maybe to go back to connect it to, I understand what you're saying.
And I mean, that's just but you see, that just to say that that's one more thing here is like that's not the end of the story, because what ends up happening is on the other side of that sacrifice, you will find and admittedly, like this is me like being a little romantic, but it's not an ungrounded romanticism. You will actually find the quality of your life will improve.
Yeah.
Everything gets richer. Okay. Uh, I mean, if you put down your cell phone and walk away from it for 3 hours, your presence will improve. Okay. And that's just another example. They're all, but you also irritate a bunch of people who are trying to you know, uh, get in touch with you, and you will then realize the extent to which you have become dependent on this device and how it infects how you relate with your reading and your knowledge and all that sort of thing. And then you have to deal with that. That's kind of a pain in the ass. But if you get back to the other, if you work through that emancipation, then you're just going to have a fuller sense of existence, in my view.
So what I'll say is that I agree that the temptation to what are the real threats to our children are often the ones that are never discussed by like modern politicians, right? Like, if you were to just skim the Twitter feed of any random set, whether it's Democratic or Republican or other, what you'd find is mainly a concern for, a set of topics that really have no material effect on children. They're not discussing the toxins in our air and water. They're not discussing the gun violence, right? I mean, maybe sometimes. But like the real risks to children are by and large, sort of completely obscured by culture war battles that while I think that they obviously have some importance for certainly for the emancipation of certain groups of people, which we should fight for. It's it's also a way of like avoiding confronting the real conditions of existence so as not to disrupt a certain way of reaping profits and using those to maintain a certain kind of corrupt political elite, right? So I understand the temptation. What I think is that the criticism from the people who maybe are against deschooling is that, well, if you keep it purely familial, if you keep it purely sort of insular to the family, that you will create sort of islands of knowledge, or you will create maybe vast disparities between certain group. Some people will have exposure to huge amounts of information, whereas other people will have extreme lack of exposure, and that returns us to sort of a period of feudal society, or creates serfs or whatever. And so I think sometimes some of that criticism is really overblown. But what I do say is that I do hope that people don't stay isolated in their own families with learning, and that there is a lot of cross-pollination within the community. I do love the idea of there being community centers where people come and congregate and learn, not just in like a formal like class setting, teacher student, but learn in myriad ways, right? Just by interacting with and being around people who come to those locations with different bodies of knowledge, different lived experiences, and things of that nature. But I understand, and I've also contemplated. I think I have two young boys, and so it's hard to watch the nearly perpetual violence, and to be aware of the ways in which our extractive industries damage ecologies, and to not want to keep them close, and to sort of filter out as much of that possible detriment as I possibly can as a father, right? But at some point, there's always the flip side is always socialization. and making sure that that they learn from other people in our communities, certain things. So yeah, so I appreciate maybe a balance there, Tom. I think you're muted. Tom, I think you're muted.
I would say that what is necessary there in regard to those concerns, and let me be quite clear that it might seem like I was being absolutist regarding my endorsement of homeschooling. Uh, Not everybody is in a position to do that,
Yeah.
and but I am generally pretty optimistic about our capacities to find solutions. Even a lot of times, though, the realization of those capacities demand an openness to nonlinear ways of framing issues. But that's kind of a tangent. What I would the fundamental thing is there has to be a faith that we as human beings are naturally, if you like, social creatures. So there is a limit broadly to the extent to which we can isolate ourselves from each other. And eventually we come back together in virtue of our very being. And so I have a faith in that as an an inextinguishable component to what we are. But it's a faith. I can't demonstrate that, right? And additionally, with respect to issues of trying to, well, that's a whole other question. Like, how do we protect our children? It's complicated because the protection also necessitates preparing them for navigating this bizarre world into which we are entering.
Yeah.
From where I stand, one of the absolute greatest dangers is actually the digital. I actually think that is almost impossible to exaggerate in terms of how hazardous it can be to what it is to be a human being. Hopefully I'm wrong. Okay, hopefully I'm totally exaggerating the strength of that sort of domain, but it's addictive and fragmenting quality. It's usefulness to anesthetize and subjugate is such that I think that more than anything is the beast of the moment to be opposed.
Well, yeah, I'll have to see what I'm interested to learn more about your perspective on that. But maybe that's a separate conversation or another
Right, we could take that up, right? I mean, in a way, it's not even, you don't even, I think, have to become especially conceptual. In terms of like firsthand experience, like I see what we're like with our phones, what I'm like with my phone, and I don't like it in the least.
Yeah.
And if I just would ask people to and look at their own sort of interior experience, like when you're on your phone, how do you feel? And
Yeah.
I can tell you, I don't feel good. The word I use is fractured. Like I look at like how my mind feels, and then like you look at how these devices have changed how we relate to each other and so forth. It's not just the phones; they just sort of exemplify certain things. But we should probably wrap it up here.
Yeah. Well,
Because
one thing I'll say about that is that I think it's also a symptom of maybe a lot of things that we've been talking about, Tom. It's like sometimes I think we look at technology as if it's the root of the problem, and I think it's actually our connection to it is intentional. So like I was having another, not to go back to maybe I'll use this as a way of segueing into my final comments here, but another conversation I was having with people online is about, someone said, they blame, the number of kids who like actually go and congregate outside has dropped precipitously since like the advent of cell phones, right? And so people tend to just blame the technology, and I understand the argument, right? But what someone else said, well, like, where can they go? What spaces do we make available for kids after school where they can go and not feel like and play, right? And not feel like that they're going to be that it's a safe space, that they can stay out past a certain time, that it's not going to be afflicted with maybe an authority figure who could do them harm, and so what I think too, though, is that if you look at the way, not to tie it back again into another, well, maybe to another aspect of the conversation that we've been talking about, but like our urban design, and how we create, shared communal spaces, how we make them available and accessible to people, is that there's been a deliberate eradication of those spaces. And my thesis, and I think this is Bookchin's thesis too, is that eradication of those spaces has not been purely economic. People fought me on this, but they said like, oh, look, no, you're just being conspiratorial here. They said there's a clear economic rationale for the way that we've designed our spaces, and I think I and Bookchin would agree that our spaces were designed for the automotive industry and the real estate industry to reap huge profits. But I think that there is another reason why, for instance, public parks and spaces are constantly underfunded by municipalities. There's a reason why when they build highways that connect spaces, they do so through minority communities. It's not just because they're the least that they lack the political power to oppose it, but it's because they always represent the potential for political power to amass that challenges the existing ruling elite, right? Like they always represent that potential other value system and logic that will defeat them, right? And so I think in a lot of ways I see people retreat to these digital spaces because they're the only ones that are left available to them. But I agree with you, Tom, that they do have all those, they can and do have those effects of dislocation and fracturing, because it's an illusion, right? It's not the same thing as, I don't think the people that I communicate with online, and I am like aggressively nice, Tom, and in the full face of undisguised acrimony and utterly despicable like sarcasm and smugness, I am aggressively nice, because I don't think that those people would act that same way if we were interacting in an actual public venue, in an actual political space where we had the possibility to exchange ideas. I do not think that they would act that way. I just don't. And okay, so maybe I'll tie it back for my final comments. I'll tie it back to another concept of Illich's, and maybe like the last comment that I want to address from what I was hearing in this battle online. One person said that any other kind of educational model is like the hyperloop to high-speed rail. That this current system we have, as I said before, is the only way to do it to scale and efficiency. And what I said, of course, is that if you actually had read Illich, which he claimed to have, or I don't know, they claim to have, that you would be aware of Illich's concept of convivial tool. you would be aware of the fact that Illich promotes an idea of technology or a particular use of technology that creates moments and well, not just moments, not just discrete moments, but an entire culture of positive contact between people, right? That it makes, I mean, the word convivial means living together, right? I mean, if you look at it,
Yes.
right? Like
Yes.
convive, right? Like live
Right.
together, right? And
Mhm.
so what I said is that, like, you know, in that battle between train and Hyperloop, Illich, if he'd ever heard of the Hyperloop, he would have despised it. He would have hated it, right? But there's this
I
idea,
mean, he like criticized the highway system. He thought
right?
there should be a maximum speed of like 15 or 20 miles an hour or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah. But it's an absurd analogy to use on a dunk of Ivan Illich, right? Like it
Right.
raised a
And
fundamental lack
clearly,
of
the
understanding.
person
Yeah,
either hasn't read him or hasn't read him deeply enough.
right,
But
exactly.
also speaks to the poverty of discourse.
Right.
I
But
know
my,
when you have to wrap it up, right? But I just, when you were talking about kids being outside, right? It just, I had to, I had something I had to say there, right? Okay. And it's, which is on top of, not in lieu or against anything that you said, because all that you said was correct, right? You have this modification of urban spaces, and yes, there are economic imperatives, but there are also these other things that go on. And by the way, I'm sometimes struck by how people really seem to just not understand that individuals who inhabit the elite strata of the world are possessed by an absolute willingness to destroy you. All right. They are not your friends. They are completely willing to kill you.
Yeah.
And have, and then go to a cocktail party. Okay. All right. That people completely underestimate the depravity of the elite. All right. If you are in possession of $1 billion, you're a sociopath.
I agree.
Okay. Nobody.
And I've made that, I actually make that argument in Mordor, California, where I say, like, you know, and again, a total tangent, Tom, but if you think about like how we conceive of like mental illness or things like that, like how we pathologize people, how we it's totally, again, I think, determined by a value system that we just accept from the ruling elite, right? And I agree with you, the thing that we should pathologize the most is this desire, this rapacity, this avarice, this desire to accumulate massive wealth. And to come back to Illich, because I know we're finishing up, but Illich says, man must choose whether to be rich in things or in the freedom to use them. Right? I mean, that's a line from Deschooling Society, right? And it reminds me of a line from Bertrand Russell, too, where he says we have to choose between the possessive and the creative. And I think that that's sort of fundamental to the debate we have about education. What is it designed for? Is it designed to help people, I think, as going back to Nietzsche said, to have these crude materialistic notions of the good life? Or is it designed to help people not only realize other notions of the good life, but to actualize them, to embody them in the spirit of how we acquire knowledge too,
Absolutely. But then, and this was the actual point that I wanted to raise about, the other thing that's happened is that we have been conditioned to believe that the world is so much more dangerous than it actually is. All right. So when I grew up in Mount Vernon, New York, which is a suburb of New York City. And, it was an okay neighborhood, but it was not, I wasn't living in Bronxville. Okay. Which competes with Beverly Hills as, the highest per capita income zip code. Okay. All right, but
But UCLA is in Beverly Hills, so I have been I have driven through the hills. I know what it's like there.
and so when I was like 6 years old, I would go down with the other kids in the apartment building, and we would play in this a concrete alley next to the apartment building. It wasn't a playground, all right? It wasn't a special space. It was a concrete alley with an 8 foot tall wall that I jumped off once and then ended up getting a split lip from which I still have a scar. Okay. So, and that was absolutely fine. I mean, and I'm sure you had similar experiences growing up. You would get on your bicycle and you would just leave your house. You wouldn't have any money. You'd be gone all day. All right. And guess what? When you came home, everything was fine. Everything was absolutely fine. So like, oh, where are they going to go? Well, you just go outside because that's what people have done for all of human fucking history. Okay. And the fact that we have conditioned people to think that, oh, if they go outside, then they're going to be subject to predators who are going to do terrible things to them. I'm not saying that there aren't predators in the world, but you have grossly exaggerated their existence, and then you have given them more power by allowing them to define the terms of the space. So on top of the variables that you've discussed, we also have to interrogate that our whole world our whole culture has become so risk averse to the point of virtual lunacy. It's like we're conditioned ourselves to be a society of agoraphobes. And I think this is something that must be resisted resolutely.
Yeah, I do see some of that for sure. I mean, for me, it was I grew up in like a neighborhood that was still being developed. So we played in the foundations of homes being built with, jumping on all the like the boards and I mean, just rife with like rusty nails. I mean, it was, yeah, we lived wild and we lived dangerously. You know, but that's something of a motto, I think, for us to carry into the future, right? Live wild, live dangerously, like, follow, dare to imagine, and understand how your imagination has been impacted by the way that you've been schooled, and try to combat that in any way that you can to try to open up the space of the possible, because I always feel this way, that you have to imagine, what's possible before you can realize it. I mean, it just has to come that way. And so I think that my hope is that, that new forms of information and knowledge sharing, which they're not even new. I mean, I think even if we look back at old ways of, like cultural transmission and knowledge sharing, like there's so much to learn from there. We don't have to necessarily reinvent the wheel. I mean, people have been sharing information for a long time. But if I'm gonna say, one last thing, I think
Yeah.
the big idea is, if you truly want to live a free life, to pursue individual pursuits, to care for your community, to open up your time and energies for creative endeavors, to spend time with the people that you love, to escape the drabness, the boredom, the constant sense of subjugation that's ever present in the current system, that I think you need not only a vision of what that life is like, and I hope that people realize that, one of my other favorite lines is that even if what you fight is abominable, you do not have to be sad to be militant. And Barth says that on the left, too frequently, combat militance is drawn up against mere delectation of enjoyment and pleasure and bliss and all these things, and that, yes, what we fight is abominable, but that does not mean that we have to be sad militants, right? That in a lot of ways, pursuing the profound joys of learning, knowledge is delicious, Barth says, and I agree. right? The profound joys of learning and the profound, joys of leisure time and creative pursuits, and labor that we choose and obligations that we choose. If we're going to pursue that life, and we should, I think we need I think we need a way of learning that doesn't just match, but that amplifies all of those pleasures of an emancipated life.
Well, I think we will leave it there. And thanks so much for chatting here. We're definitely gonna have to do a follow-up, right? Because like you said, we've merely scratched the surface here. So
Yeah, 100 points of departure we could probably take, and so more to say, but it was fun, Tom.
thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
All right. Talk to you in a while.
All right, see ya.
Bye.